It's a great pleasure to introduce and welcome Michael Brownlee here to the stage from UCCS.
It's been wonderful to be here today. You know, it is such a privilege to be among people who are grappling with the issues of food and sustainability. So I've really been inspired to learn what's happening in this area. You know, and I've heard several times today people say, well, Boulder is so far ahead of what we're doing here. I want to tell you it's not true. There's something that's more alive here than I've seen almost anywhere in the Front Range. So I want to encourage you and celebrate what you're doing. I'll start by saying that how humanity will feed itself in an increasingly uncertain future is surely the single most important and most urgent challenge of our time. But it seems like only a handful of people on the planet can currently see this. There's a lot that needs to be said about these days, but it seems to me that some things are not being said clearly enough or often enough. And so I'm primarily a writer, so I've actually written what I wanted to say tonight. Especially because some of what needs to be said is rather difficult. It's a little bit edgy, controversial maybe, and perhaps even a little dangerous. And I trust what I write much more than what I might say spontaneously, because I can choose my words more carefully and I can make sure that I actually get to where I'm trying to go with what I'm saying. So I trust that it will be okay with you if I'll read from my notes from time to time when I need to, and that you'll hear me out. And afterwards, I would be delighted to consider some questions and have a candid conversation together. Actually, that's what I look forward to more than anything else. And I want to make sure that we have time for that. For me, what I have been writing and thinking and saying regarding local food began to take on something of a new direction and a new urgency after the September 2013 flood that brought such devastation to northern Colorado. So I want to talk about that event a little bit because there are many important lessons here. But first, just a little by way of background, for the last several years, our organization, now known as Local Food Shift Group, in collaboration with many others throughout the Front Range, we've been completely focused on local food, starting with increasing demand and consumption. But only in the last few years have we finally been able to articulate that what we're really about is localizing our food supply to the greatest extent possible, beginning right here in the Colorado Front Range. And thanks to thousands of people coming together around local food, this effort is beginning to be modestly successful. Amazingly, we've seen local food become one of the fastest growing and most promising sectors of the Colorado Front Range economy. We've witnessed an explosion in the number of community-supported agriculture, or CSA, shares in the region. We've seen a proliferation of farmers markets, farm stands popping up around the countryside, scores of farm-to-table dinners every summer, dozens of new farms and farmers, and considerable new acreage devoted to food production for local consumption. And very encouragingly, a number of restaurants sourcing local food have just multiplied dramatically. Retailers and chefs alike have begun to realize that eaters have begun to prefer locally produced food even over organic. That's very encouragingly. And accordingly, a whole new crop of food entrepreneurs has been sprouting up to meet the rapidly growing demand for local food. Many young people are discovering whole new careers in local food, and older producers are finding new markets that they scarcely dreamed were possible. So a whole new industry is beginning to emerge around the extraordinary opportunities of local food, an industry, by the way, which is very hungry for capital. And with the arrival of slow money that Nana mentioned, many of our citizens, well, I wish I could say many, several of our citizens are discovering the joys of moving some of their financial resources into the local food economy. Very exciting. And so with all this happening, it's no coincidence that for the last 8 years or so, our organization has been deeply involved in every aspect of this story. After all, early on, we declared an optimistic, if rather naive, goal of 25% food localization in Colorado within a decade, noting the economic potential of 31,000 new jobs for the state. And we've helped mobilize millions of dollars of local capital in this direction, utilizing the principles and the ethics of slow money. So we've been a catalyst, you could say, in the process of food localization. So all of these people working together on all of this, we've been making steady progress, although we're still a long way from that goal of 25% local food. But with the September flood, the localization of our food supply in the Front Range suffered a serious setback. So we can now say that local food production in the Front Range will likely be less in 2014 than it was in 2013. And those commercial buyers who have been working so hard to increase their local sourcing are worried that supply may run short this season. They know that they're probably going to have to buy more from Mexico and from California, and that because of the drought in California's Central Valley, which provides something like half of all the fruit, nuts, and vegetables that we eat in this country, and maybe 90% of the nation's organic produce, because of what's happening there will be less fresh, healthy food available, and what is available will cost more. We don't know exactly, of course, how all of this is going to play out, and there are certainly opportunities that arise in a situation like this. But it is my hope that this situation will provide something of a teachable moment for all of us about our food supply. I'll say it was a tremendous and very weird storm back in September. It was a rare weather system that basically got stuck over the area for several days. In Boulder, they say we got a 1,000-year rain. That was about 21 inches in a week, when we normally get 19 inches of moisture in an entire year. So the result was not just a flash flood, but a sustained torrent of water that ripped away homes and highways and dams and livestock and businesses and lives, along with much of the infrastructure that keeps our normally scarce water supply flowing where we humans prefer it to flow. And you've all seen the photos of the devastation. But what was almost invisible in all of this was the damage to local agriculture, especially to local food production. Over a 24-county area, the 500-year flood inundated more than 28,000 acres of cropland, mostly conventional, and 39,000 acres of pasture land. It's huge. Total agricultural losses were conservatively estimated in the tens of millions. In addition to loss of topsoil, fencing, animal feed, and livestock, most of our small farmers and ranchers suffered significant loss of income because the flood came right at the very peak of the season. The farmers' markets had to be closed for 2 weekends in a row. CSA deliveries were halted, and customers couldn't navigate through flooded country roads to get to their favorite farm stands. And anything growing in a field that was touched by floodwater had to be destroyed because of possible contamination from sewer water. But even fields that were spared from the flood were unharvestable because of the deep mud. The ground was seriously oversaturated, and lots of produce was left to rot in the field. One farmer we know lost his entire crop of tomatoes this way, about $250,000 worth. That's very depressing. And as many will tell you, that's just the nature of farming. But for many, this was far worse than the usual uncertainties of farming and ranching. And while hundreds of millions of dollars in flood relief funds poured into the Front Range, virtually none of that money was available to help local farms and ranches and food-related businesses. Local producers who are essentially ineligible for crop insurance quickly discovered that there would be no federal assistance for them. Nothing from FEMA or the USDA or nothing from the Small Business Administration, which doesn't deal with agriculture. And there was almost nothing from the state either. The industrial food supply system simply overlooks small food producers. Almost no support was available except from the venerable Farm Aid organization, which in times of disaster cheerfully doles out checks of $500 each to help farmers and ranchers with basic household expenses. So it became clear that in reality, any financial aid would have to come from the community itself. And that's a whole other story. The greatest blow to food production was the extreme damage to the aging ditch irrigation system, which nearly all our farmers and ranchers in northern Colorado depend on as their primary source of water. It was built during the gold rush days in the 1860s. And much of that sprawling system of ditches was destroyed by the flood, threatening producers with a severe shortage of water right after their crops nearly drowned in water. And the cost of rebuilding the main ditches in the Front Range has been estimated as high as $200 million. And that doesn't include the laterals that come off the main ditches to reach the individual producers. It also doesn't include the increase in water rates that the ditch companies are charging to pay off the massive 30-year repair loans made available to them. Beginning this year, some farmers will be paying water rates 1,000% higher than last year, adding to their stress. And right at this moment, work crews are racing to complete repairs to the ditch system, but it's already clear that some producers will not have water this year. NPR ran a story a couple of weeks ago quoting state officials who estimated 30 to 40% of our farmers and ranchers will not have water by May 1. Think about what that means. Worse, runoff from the normally highly valued winter mountain snowpack may cause additional flooding this spring. And some of our climatologists will quietly tell you that they're worried that last September's devastating storm could be the beginning of a repeating annual pattern. So all of this casts a great pall of uncertainty over the whole agricultural community. As producers rebuild, they must learn to adapt to a new world of climate chaos. Farming has always been a matter of dealing resolutely with nature's unpredictability, but now our local farmers and ranchers stand at the precipice of a time of radically increasing uncertainty. And meanwhile, with increasing demand for local food, our commercial buyers are concerned that local food supplies could be shrinking in the foreseeable future. So for those of us who've been working on localizing our food supply, the flood was a rude awakening. We suddenly realized that in all our efforts to build a truly local food supply chain, a local food ecology, if you will, we had not been thinking about building resilience into that system. Well, we are now, and we're working to organize a permanent relief fund to assist our local producers in times of future disasters. Several years ago, when our organization started to map our current food shed, the flow of food coming to us in Colorado, we quickly saw that most of our food was coming from very far away, that of all the $12 billion worth of food that we consume in Colorado, as much as 97% of that was imported from outside the state in an agricultural state. And the costs of that imbalance are profound. It's a completely upside-down system. And it means that our current food shed really stretches around the globe. And this is characteristic of the food system that most of us are highly dependent upon, and characteristic of our export-oriented agricultural system. Amazingly, nationally, we import almost as much food as we export. And the great economist Herman Daly famously had something to say about this system a number of years ago when he noted, Americans import Danish butter cookies, and Danes import American butter cookies. Exchanging recipes would surely be more efficient. And when we think about the hidden costs of such a system, the picture is really quite appalling. And I think it's reasonable to say that this situation is insane. When we look at the amount and the type of food that we're exporting to other countries in the name of feeding the world, we start to get a sense of what a deception it really is. It needs to be said that the so-called food that we're producing in this system is not designed for the health of those who eat it. It is designed for the profitability of the transnational corporations that are making it available. It's not even designed for the profitability of the farmers, because the profits in this system are squeezed out of the bottom of the supply chain so that they accumulate to the top. In this model, food is truly a commodity. It's all about the profits. It's not about nutrition. It's not about health. It's not even really about feeding people. It's a sham. It's a deception. If we're going to feed our own populations, our local populations, to any significant degree, and if we're going to empower people in other nations to feed themselves sustainably, then we're going to have to convert a significant amount of our current commodity crop production and export agriculture to sustainably growing food for local consumption. This is a profound reversal of a paradigm that is deeply rooted in this nation, rooted in an economy of extraction and consumption, with no regards to the costs, to the ecosystem, or the negative impacts on human health. This is the agricultural paradigm that our federal government supports through the USDA and the Farm Bill. In this paradigm, they do not want us to localize our food supply, for that runs counter to what they're trying to accomplish. It's also the paradigm that our own Colorado government supports. A few weeks ago, I was at the Governor's Agricultural Forum in Denver, where the Commissioner of Agriculture, John Salazar, captured perfectly the problems of this current food system when he proudly proclaimed, and I quote, that in Colorado we produce the most abundant, the safest, and the cheapest food in the world. It would be worth taking a little time to deconstruct what he said, but I won't do that tonight. I'll simply say that I can't think of a single farmer or rancher I know who is excited about Colorado producing the cheapest food in the world. That's part of the reason it's so difficult for many of them to make a living at this. Salazar also boasted that most Americans only spend 6% of their income on food. Well, I can tell you that that certainly won't be true in the future. It's very well known, of course, that hundreds of millions of people in the world go hungry every day, and that poverty and food insecurity are inextricably linked, and that as human population continues to soar, demand for food production will rapidly increase, and so will food prices. But this is not just an issue for the low income or the downtrodden. It turns out that we're all food insecure, whether we realize it or not. It's essential for us to understand that the global industrial food system has become the largest and most destructive and least sustainable industry in the entire world. It burns up about 23% of global oil and gas supplies, 23%. And it contributes as much as 49% of total greenhouse gas emissions. And it has been fouling our natural environment, destroying topsoils, depleting our freshwater reserves, weakening our bodies and our minds, decreasing human life expectancy, undermining local economies, and severing our relationship with the land and with all that is sacred in life. In its near total dominance of the way that we feed ourselves, the global industrial food system has essentially colonized significant aspects of our lives, seeking ever greater control of our food supply and ever greater influence over what and how we eat. And now controlling the vast majority of our U.S. food supply, this unholy alliance has gradually trained our citizenry to become consumers, no longer able to meet our own food needs locally, bound to follow behavioral impulses cultivated by giant marketing machines, creating a ruthless and unprecedented and artificial dependency for the most basic of requirements for human life, and all the while delivering ever poorer quality food to our tables while simultaneously wreaking havoc on our planet. And with their powerful marketing and propaganda campaigns, they have assisted us in becoming, over the last 65 years, becoming mostly unconscious about where our food comes from and how it impacts the quality and viability of life on this planet. This is, of course, part of a growing disconnection from nature, from our humanity, and from spirit. Please don't ever let anyone refer to you as a consumer. This global food system has so resolutely placed corporate power and profits far above the well-being of life on this planet, externalizing its costs, that the result is a growing global food catastrophe, representing perhaps the greatest assault on human freedom and sovereignty since World War II. In the name of free trade and free enterprise and corporate profits and economic expansion, a frightening monster has been unleashed that has the advantage of both being invisible and unnamed. We need to make it eminently visible and to name it properly for what it is. And now this alliance of big food and big ag is now rapidly destroying the very conditions that are conducive to life, to the point that the global industrial food system is an overwhelming contributor to what many scientists are now calling the sixth mass extinction of species on the planet, whereby as many as 200 species are disappearing every single day. It is an obvious, if largely unspoken, reality that our global industrialized food system is profoundly unsustainable. Less obvious is the reality that it is also becoming increasingly unstable. The entire global industrial food system is recklessly teetering on the brink of collapse just at the moment that it pretends to be ramping up to be able to feed a world of some 9 or 10 billion people by the middle of the century, when in fact this global industrial food system has itself become the greatest threat to humanity being able to feed itself. As Derek Jensen says, any economic system that does not benefit the natural communities on which it is based is unsustainable, immoral, and really stupid. We will not need to change this system, but we will need to replace it. If humanity is to have a future that is both tolerable and resilient on a planet where life can thrive, we must regain control over our food supply. We must recover our capacity to feed ourselves. And in the process, we must regain our food sovereignty and food security, which have been almost completely lost over the last 65 years or so. All of this is essential in securing the future of humanity and the viability of life on this planet. Given what we know now, it is undeniable that what is urgently needed is a widespread revolution in the way humanity feeds itself. It is undeniable that what is needed is a massive revolutionary movement to localize the global food supply to the greatest extent possible, starting in our own communities and regional food sheds. This is not just about some cool or hip lifestyle choice. This is the most important and most urgent social cause of our time. And of course, many of you here in this room are right at the forefront of this historic revolution, or you soon will be, facing the daunting challenge of localizing our food supply, forging a new and regenerative way for humanity to feed itself. We're not trying to change the big ag, big food system. Instead, we're raising up a whole new system, an alternative that's focused on feeding our local population first and exporting the surplus rather than trying to feed the world. Fundamentally, localizing our food supply is right at the heart of an effort to bring healing and restoration and regeneration into our world, to begin to reverse the widespread destruction caused by the industrial growth society. And since food is what catalyzed human civilization in the first place, it's appropriate that the effort to reverse the damage of the industrial growth society should also begin with food. There is no issue or human activity more fundamental than the way that we feed ourselves. It is the very foundation of human society. I didn't bring a beer with me. As we first got into this work, we were often confronted with a question, I'm sure many of you are too. What's your definition of local? And we notice that this question is often asked in a tone of slightly veiled anger or hostility or derision. And we quickly came to realize that this is a trick question that gets people all tangled up in a meaningless debate. And our answer, it took us a while to figure this out, but our answer finally became very simple. As local as possible. It's just that simple. But there's an underlying question that doesn't get asked often enough, and that is, what's the local population exactly that we're trying to feed? And along with that, we need to ask, what's the land base that could produce a significant amount of local food for these people? So there are no easy answers to these questions, for sure. But we began taking a stab at it in thinking about our local food shed in terms of what demographers call the Front Range Urban Corridor. This is an 18-county area that stretches from Laramie, Wyoming, down to Pueblo. It's home to some 4.3 million people and growing rapidly. 85% of Colorado's population lives here. That, we say, is our local population. And the good news is that within these 18 counties, there are currently more than 9 million acres of farm and ranch land. And while much of that land, of course, is now being used for hay production and animal pasturing and commodity crop production for export, there is great potential here for sufficient food production to feed the entire population to a great extent. So in this context, we believe that a goal of 25% food localization is achievable here. We call this the Front Range Food Shed, and we have, as Nana mentioned, a publication about this, Thinking Like a Food Shed. I picked up a box of them tonight to share with you all, only to discover when I pulled them out of the car it was a box of something else. So I'm sorry I couldn't bring them with them. But all of the content from Thinking Like a Food Shed is available on our website, localfoodshift.com, and we're planning a new issue coming up soon. But with this magazine, we're learning how to build food shed consciousness, if you will, which we know is going to be essential going forward. It's a holistic, systemic approach that we're cultivating. And as many of you know, here in the Front Range Food Shed, there is a growing network of people who are dedicated to providing eaters with access to the freshest, highest quality, most nutritious, most sustainably produced local food. It's a local food supply chain that's forming of growers and value-added producers and aggregators and processors and distributors and wholesalers and chefs and restaurateurs and retailers and institutional buyers. And this emerging local food supply chain is reaching out to the growing number of eaters who are waking up from a long sleep of unconsciousness about our food supply and are increasingly concerned with the social, economic, ethical, environmental, health, and cultural implications of how they eat. These are people who long to move from an immoral, destructive global economy to a moral and sustainable and resilient local economy. People who are rapidly learning the difference between cost and price, and learning, as we all must, to secede from the union of industrial food. We'll need to hurry. A new report is coming from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which will show that because of climate change, we can expect that global food production capacity will be reduced by 2% per decade, or 17% by the end of the century. And this is happening at a time when population pressure will increase demand for food by 14% per decade. But the problem with these projections is that the IPCC's numbers are far too conservative. They fail to take into account positive feedbacks like methane emissions unleashed from the melting Arctic. Scientists from the Arctic Methane Emergency Group now project a potential global increase of 6 degrees Celsius within a decade. That's nearly 11 degrees Fahrenheit. And they also say that at 4 degrees Celsius increase, agriculture as we know it is no longer possible. And at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, in Boulder, scientist Jeffrey Kyle has been looking at global temperatures the last time that in geologic history, when CO2 levels got as high as they are expected to be by the end of this century. And he concludes from that geological record that we could see a 16 degrees Celsius increase by 2100. That's more than 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Taking all of this into account, plus the likelihood of massive permanent flooding of vast swaths of coastal agricultural land due to sea level rise, some sources are saying that global food production could be reduced by 20 to 30% in the next 2 to 3 decades. Yes, this is extremely serious. The global industrial food supply chain will fail us, and soon. If we look at all these projections and add to them the increasing climate chaos that we're already beginning to experience, including the very shifting of the seasons of the year and the migration of various species of life northward or to higher altitudes to escape the biggest impacts of warming, we can see that the future of food is fraught with challenges. And that if we are to avoid massive starvation, even in this country, even right here in the Front Range, even within the next decade or so, then we will have to find new ways to feed ourselves, and quickly. And the most effective way of feeding ourselves, our local populations, is by significantly increasing local food production. Every way we can, as quickly as we can. And in this regard, as many have mentioned today, we all need to learn to be producers. As environmental writer Ellen LeConte says, garden as if your life depended on it, because it will. Take up spade, rake, and hoe, she says. Make compost and raise good soil and garden beds with a vengeance, starting this spring and with an eye toward forever. Anna LePay puts it a little bit more positively. She says, we are not bystanders. Each of us is a player in one of the biggest stories ever. Global warming isn't just happening on the grand scale to icebergs somewhere out there or in deliberations in capitals of far-off countries. Global warming is happening to us right here, right now, in very real ways every day. She says, and we in turn can be part of transforming the climate change story from one of hopelessness to one of renewal, regeneration, and resilience. There are powerful ways to be part of this historic shift, she says, among them aligning ourselves with a sane food system in our own communities, supporting the work globally to shift toward food sustainability and honoring those farmers who are, we can now see, among the planet's real climate heroes. We're all familiar with the often repeated myth that to feed the world's growing population, we will have to rely on large-scale agrochemical industrial agriculture. That's pure marketing propaganda that big ag and big food use to make eaters and farmers alike more dependent on their chemicals and their technologies. It's just one of the ways that they turn eaters into consumers and farmers into debt-ridden corporate slaves. As Mark Bittman said in, who reads Mark Bittman? Anybody? Yeah. He said in the New York Times last fall, there are so many hungry people in the world, not because food is lacking, but because not all of those calories go to feed humans. And last month, Frances Moore LePay explained this very succinctly. She said, a third of all food is literally wasted, and we waste vast food potential by devoting 3/4 of all agricultural land to animal food production that supplies only 16% of our calories. She says, in fact, of all the calories livestock consume, humans get only 3% in the flesh that we eat, animal flesh that we eat. Bittman describes two major food systems in the world, one industrial and the other small landholders. The small landholder approach is much more efficient than the industrial model. And he references research from the ETC group in Ottawa showing that the industrial food chain uses 70% of the world's agricultural resources to supply only 30% of the world's food. On the other hand, smallholders, sometimes called the peasant food web, they produce the other 70% of the world's food supply with only 30% of the resources. The conclusion, Bittman says, is straightforward and unequivocal. Small landholders can produce more food and more kinds of food with fewer resources and lower transportation costs, which means a lower carbon footprint, while providing greater food security, maintaining greater biodiversity, and even better withstanding the effects of climate change. From traditional and conventional circles, we often hear that there is no way that local food and farming can feed the world. I think that we're discovering that that perspective is not only misguided, but very destructive. And I'm inspired by the words of Brian Snyder of the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture, who said, we must encourage everyone, wherever they are and as a priority, to eat food produced as near to their own homes as possible. Secondly, feed thy neighbor as thyself. He says, from this perspective, local food not only can feed the world, it may be the only way to ever feed the world in a healthy and just manner. We know already that small food production is quite a bit more efficient in raising food than conventional or commodity crop agriculture, but I want to just add a little perspective to this. Standard commodity crop commercial agriculture yields on average somewhere in the range of $1,000 worth of product per acre per year. That's a ballpark number, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb, $1,000 per acre per year. Whether you're talking about wheat or corn or soybeans, it's in that range. With intensive organic agriculture of the type that's going on around here now, we're seeing in many places in Colorado small farms from a few acres to a few hundred acres using biointensive methods, organic primarily, but not necessarily certified. These kinds of farms are producing conservatively about $10,000 worth of produce per acre per year. So that's a whole order of magnitude above what's usual with commodity crop agriculture. So we already know that this is a far better, more efficient way of growing food than conventional ag. But we also know that this kind of production is very vulnerable to the effects of weather, vulnerable to land prices, to labor shortages, and various climate and other kinds of disasters. And besides, there's just not enough production going on at this scale here in Colorado, so that now demand for local food is far greater than supply. And actually that's true pretty much across the country, unfortunately. So if our global food supply chain was interrupted, which it inevitably will be, we will face food shortages right here in our home territory because there is simply not enough supply. We all know that water's a problem here, that labor's a problem, that cost of land and access to land are problems. And while there's great increase in home gardening and community gardening and urban agriculture, all this is still not yet enough to significantly move the needle on local food production. So how could we greatly increase local food production in just a few years? Well, we've been inspired lately by a number of people who are working on alternative methods of food production that could all be classed together as controlled environment agriculture. It's been mentioned many times here today. Hoop houses, low tunnels, high tunnels, greenhouses, hydroponics, aquaponics, aeroponics, all of it. Controlled environment ag. Of course, there are many, many different approaches to this, but the one that has been particularly fascinating to me recently has been brought forward by the innovative social entrepreneur Buck Adams in Denver. Anybody know about Buck Adams? He founded Circle Fresh Farm several years ago in Denver and later went on to start a visionary nonprofit venture called Veterans to Farmers. And the type of greenhouses that he and his network of producers are building these days are capable of producing as much as $1 million worth of produce per acre per year. That's 2 orders of magnitude above our best biointensive organic food production, 3 orders of magnitude greater than commodity crop production. At the same time, utilizing a tiny fraction of the water in the land. Circle Fresh Farms, some of you may have read recently, is in the process of taking over an older greenhouse up by Fort Lupton with 1.5 million square feet. And about 1/3 of this is going to be put into food production. That's more than 11 acres of greenhouse. That's massive. It's a breakthrough. And it's just the beginning of things to come. Veterans to Farmers, on the other hand, is involved to build plans to build 40 acres of greenhouses on City of Denver land, where the airport used to be. And this will certainly go a long way towards making it possible for Denver to meet its official sustainability goal of 20% food localization by 2020. And that's a very brave initiative of Mayor Michael Hancock, who grew up in a Denver food desert and understands very well the challenges ahead. So these are the kinds of developments I think are needed to take local food production to scale sustainably, resiliently, and quickly. So it turns out, I'll say that this work is far more difficult than almost anyone is willing to discuss. It's so easy to get buoyed up by all the great projects that seem to be exploding into existence everywhere, and those projects for sure give us hope. But when we allow ourselves to look at the scale of what's actually been achieved so far, it's clear that our efforts are rather modest in the face of the immensity and the inertia of the global industrial food system. And this really became clear to us last year when we had a visit from Vermont's Philip Ackerman Leist, author of the book Rebuilding the Food Shed, which I highly recommend. We've always considered Vermont to be the mecca of local food, having gotten farther along than almost anyone else. But Philip told us that after 13 years of intense effort, Vermont is only at 5% local food. And he says the next 5% is going to be a lot tougher. And what's more, it turns out that the global climate change situation, as I've described, is far worse than we realized. So there is no way to avoid the reality, I think, that we're in for a very rough ride on this planet. There is no way of negotiating a soft landing here. Nevertheless, the work that we are all doing together here is crucial. It's absolutely essential. We must do everything we can to feed our local populations. What's really at stake in all of this is not the survival of humanity, but the survival of human freedom and human sovereignty. I think of the words of Tim de Christopher, one of my heroes. He says, if you look at the worst case consequences of climate change, those pretty much mean the collapse of our industrial civilization. But that doesn't mean the end of everything. It means that we're going to be living through the most rapid and intense period of change that humanity has ever faced. And that's certainly not hopeless. He says it means that we're going to have to build another world in the ashes of this one. And it could easily be a better world. Big corporate agriculture says we need to feed the world, but we're not going to feed the world. The people of the world are going to learn to feed themselves. If we do all of this well, we have an opportunity to build localized food sheds that are economically robust, environmentally sustainable, resilient, and self-reliant, that ensure food security and food sovereignty and food justice for all, that contribute to the health and the happiness of our citizens, and that revitalize our local economies. That is what the local food shift is all about. And we're a long way from getting there in the Colorado Front Range. But we're on the pathway, things are moving, and I'm astonished at what's emerging in our midst. And it's our hope that what we're doing all together here in the Front Range may become a whole systems food shed demonstration project, which can serve as a catalytic model for actualizing the food revolution in communities and food sheds everywhere. However, we don't know if food localization will happen in our area quickly enough or at significant enough scale to avert disaster. We just don't know. In our organization, along with many others, we're moving as quickly as we can, paying attention as best we can, catalyzing the emergence of food localization in every way we can, and it is such an adventure. It is such a joy to be involved in this effort, and it's by far the most difficult and challenging thing that we've ever done in our lives. But it's happening, not because of us, but with us. We're part of it, deeply implicated. It's such a privilege to give our lives this way. And you, here in this room, are the very foundation of this emerging, localized food shed. You are where the revolution starts in the way our society feeds itself. Just finish up with this. Back in 1965, and I can actually remember this, in 65, in Montgomery, Alabama, Martin Luther King Jr. said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And in that same spirit, I'll just share this. May we align ourselves with that long evolutionary arc of the moral sacred universe and end the reign of those who would control our food supply, those who would control the very forces of nature, those who would control what is most precious and sacred in our seeds, soils, and souls. May we restore soils and souls and hearts and minds and reverse this dreadful course that threatens to dominate our humanity and undermine our freedom. May we truly be people of the earth, connected with the land and water and sky and the natural cycles of life, connected with the tides of the seasons, connected with each other, and connected with the greater community of life, connected with the sun and the moon and the planets and the stars and the galaxies. And may we be connected with that sacred evolutionary spark that dwells within each of us. That is my prayer and my plea. Thank you very much.